Well, ladies and gentlemen, would you know it is a Monday morning and back to work, unfortunately. But in any case, before we get onto the main video of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It really does help. And if you want to support the work that I do here, you're welcome to buy me a coffee. The link is in the description box below. So let's get straight into the news. And the first one actually is around Paul Mashatile, because Paul Mashatile says Pretoria will not beg Washington even as tensions grow amid the US imposition of the 30% tariffs on South African goods. Now, he frames the situation as one where South Africa must preserve its dignity and negotiate from strength, not from a posture of submissiveness. Now, he calls for market diversification and mentions engaging with countries like China, India, and Russia, BRICS basically, and the EU as alternative trade partners to the US. And if you watched any of my videos, you'd understand why that's not actually as straightforward as he likes to say. Now, he does give a warning of serious economic consequences if no deal is struck. Now, despite what Paul Mashatile has to say, there has been warnings of serious economic consequences if no deal is struck. Suppliers in South Africa that serve OEMs or original equipment manufacturers exporting to the US could see production cutbacks, which would mean jobs, investment, and competitiveness are all at risk. Now, if you take the automotive sector, for example, whilst it may be heavily integrated globally, there are many workers and companies that depend on trade with the US, and a 30% trade tariff does threaten this sector profoundly. So why Paul is just dismissive of the US, well, I don't really know. But what I can say is that Paul Mashatile, in a different address, suggested to Parliament that he was declaring that he had no hidden skeletons, no shenanigans, if you want to call it that. He said that there was nothing undeclared and no corrupt practices with himself. He says that he leads a transparent and accountable life. And this is all set against a backdrop of political scrutiny of public officials and demands for higher transparency. Now, if you know, News 24 have done numerous expos on Paul Mashatile and suggested that his lifestyle might not be as squeaky clean as he says. But he claims, well, actually it's all lies because he is squeaky clean. I mean, an ANC minister who claims he's squeaky clean, well, that's never happened before, has it? He said they all say they're squeaky clean. In fact, even Imbalula has recently said that, 99% of the ANC may be corrupt, but that's okay, because you can't then say the ANC is entirely corrupt, because there's like 1% of it that's not corrupt. This isn't the win you think it is for Kilo. In any case, whilst Paul Mashatile makes these claims, the problem is that everybody else remains skeptical about anything to do with the ANC. And the reason for that is because we all know what the ANC is like. And they're not squeaky clean. They're looters. We know this to be true. Now, talking of the trade tariffs, news is that a revised trade offer to the US has been sent and feedback has finally been achieved. So, as you know, the revised trade offer to the US was to try to reduce or avoid the impacts of the 30% tariffs. Now, Cabinet, that's our Cabinet, have approved this revised offer and described the offer that we sent to the Americans as broad, generous, and open. So I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, you want to know what we offered the US. Well, South Africa has offered nearly 60 billion rand in private investment as part of a framework deal. Now, the offer aims to show seriousness and willingness on South Africa's part to meet some US concerns, or at least to give tangible incentives. South Africa has also said that it wants to export finished goods, especially critical minerals, not just raw materials. So this is all part of his bargaining position. Now, you've got to understand why that is, because what South Africa is saying is that when we export our minerals, those minerals are used to create products or goods or services in the US, which in turn creates jobs. Those jobs or products could effectively be well done here, and they could service the local economy and could improve productivity and obviously create jobs. That's the general idea. Now, the US, as you know, has in the past suggested that there were policies that were unacceptable to it, noticeably BEE and affirmative action. And there are sectors that the US wants South Africa to address in terms of trade barriers, quality or sanity, and poultry is a really good example of this. Now, while South Africa's offer is to export finished critical mineral products to the US as part of the negotiations, we don't yet know whether the US seems to want these goods, these manufactured goods being sent to them, or whether they just want the raw materials. So, ladies and gentlemen, what exactly was the United States comments? I mean, we now know that we've sent this offer and the US has actually responded. And the answer is, well, we don't know, because none of the details have been made public. Now, some of the measures will include, as you know, will be greater market access, possibly aligning with some of the EU trade tariff regimes and addressing intellectual property or sanitary plant health issues. As we've just said, they want all of this type of stuff with South Africa. So the counter offer from the US is going to no doubt include some of that. Now, there is an increased push, as you know from the previous article, for South Africa to look beyond the US to trade with China, Japan, the Middle East, and regional market by the African Continental Free Trade Area. And all of those have been mentioned by government. Now, according to the news, the government has assembled a high-level negotiation team led by the presidency. Also, the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition and Agriculture itself will be liaising with its US counterparts. So the idea at the moment is South Africa sent an offer, the US has sent an offer back. We know that that offer from the US is going to include issues such as intellectual property, is going to include something around the markets they want to get into. And we don't know yet whether they've accepted some of South Africa's conditions. All we know at this point in time is that the presidency and the relevant departments are engaging with the United States directly on the negotiations. But as I've already said, and if you missed it, it's likely that they'll land up with a deal similar to what they negotiated with the EU. It's very unlikely that South Africa will ultimately land up with a deal that is zero tariffs. The EU landed up with a small tariff of 15%. So it could be a situation that South Africa lands up with a similar trade deal. But at this point in time, we know there were red lines that the US wanted to sort it out. BE was a good example. We don't know if those have been sorted. So at this point in time, just keep watching. But talking of BEE, it's very interesting to note that Paul Mashatile, who is now becoming a defender of what we can only class as the ANC's RET policies, has defended BBBEEE. And he tells the MPs that scrapping it would mean that South Africa would go back to apartheid. And there's always apartheid with these people. Always. I don't know where the logic comes from. It's always apartheid. So it's like the big boogeyman that they just won't let go of. In any case, Paul Mashatile defends broad-based black economic empowerment as a policy at a parliamentary session. Now, he did a parliamentary session. They asked him some questions, and apparently he got very vocal on this issue. Now, his argument is that doing away with BBBEEE would essentially be returning us to apartheid-level inequality. And that in itself, I must say, I think is racist. Because what Paul is effectively saying is that in the open market, black people are unable to succeed without government interference. And that in itself is what racist. He frames BE not as a racial quota system, but as a transformative tool, which he says is needed to correct historical and ongoing economic discrimination. Yes, Paul, but you've been there for 30 years, and the rules are just getting worse and worse and worse, and inequality is increasing. So if you really want to address historical and ongoing economic discrimination, try a different model, because this one's not working. But you see, the ANC appears too wedded to its ideological dogma and doesn't seem to be able to change tack because they're just incapable of it. Now, you may look at that and say, well, why are they incapable of it? Is this all by design? And the real answer is, well, no, I don't think it is by design. But you see, the reality is that many of these ANC cadres have all become self-enriched. Their lives have been transformed. And as I said before, turkeys are not going to vote for Christmas, and you cannot expect it to do so. In any case, Paul Mashatile argues that black people currently make up the majority in South Africa, but the wealth or control of the economy is still disproportionately in white hands, hence the necessity of BEE. And to be honest with you, Paul, you can keep doing BEE till Jesus comes back for all anyone cares, and the reality is it's not going to change, because your policies do not create wealth. They create wealth in concentrated, politically connected elites, nothing more. In any case, moving on, the presidency of the ANC Youth League. Yeah, I didn't even know they were still a thing, but that's Colleen. In his speech at the Second National General Council, the NGC in Kimberley, strongly criticizes the DA's role in the GNU. And it's only the other day that apparently the GNU and the involvement of the DA showed the democracy and the strength of the republic was great. Now these guys condemn it. And so what we typically tend to see with the ANC is just constantly a high degree of schizophrenia. Now, according to Colleen, they've accused the DA of pretending to be a strategic partner but actually undermining the ANC from within. Well, yes, that's what happens. You're competing political parties. You're meant to undermine each other because you want to win the next election with an outright majority mandate. Like, I would have thought this was obvious to anybody. You didn't merge and become one, but, apparently the Youth League's just not that bright. Now, he warns that the ANC's electoral decline must be seen as a signal for renewal, not just numerically, but also quantitatively. In other words, ideological and ethically. So, in other words, the ANC is declining, double down on the ideology that caused your decline. Again, not very bright. And he says, we must have political clarity to distinguish between a friend and an enemy, between a genuine revolutionary and an opportunist. It's always the same. Revolution, yeah, friend, enemy. This is stupid. This narrative, this ideology doesn't grow a country. It divides a country. And divided countries don't grow, you clown. We're not a generation of cowards, he says. No one can explain why blacks are still poor 31 years later. Well, yeah, they can. ANC looted all the money. ANC destroyed the opportunity. ANC drove capital away. ANC hoarded all the cash for themselves. And ANC enriched themselves while making the rest of the state poorer. There you go. I just explained it to you in like 30 seconds. See? It wasn't that hard, was it? And he also criticized ANC leaders who send their kids to private schools while public education remains failing. Yeah, like what I just said, right? ANC send all their kids abroad and self-enrich. They don't care about the rest of the state. See, yeah, we can say, well, black people are still poor in the Republic 31 years later because of the ANC. Now, he calls on his fellow students and youth to be more broadly involved in the demanding of accountability and integrity from ANC leaders. I must say that those are two words that ANC leaders probably don't really understand. You might need to get in the dictionary. Accountability and integrity? Come on, don't make me laugh. And I guess let's move on to the final news article of today, and that is around the NHI. Because in one news article issued last week, apparently the lives of everyone are at risk, says healthcare experts. Now, I must say, I did read this article and I did think, okay, well, here's a NHR puff piece. And these experts are warning that many lives are currently at risk due to the gaps in the public healthcare system. Yes, the public healthcare system, like Tembisa, that keeps getting looted dry by the ANC and the ANC cadres. Now, he says that there is an urgent need to implement universal health coverage. We have that already, called the public healthcare system, which is failing, which he just drew reference to. And he says that there are problems. He says there's unequal access to healthcare services because, the government system is crap and everybody gets really bad service, whereas the private sector is, pretty well managed. And he says that this is due to under-resourced facilities. Well, the resources aren't under-resourced. The resources they get are stolen, and they overspend on stuff because they're enriching cadres and ANC members. They're not actually purchasing things and getting the best deal so that their money can go further in order to improve the quality of services. So he says that there are disparities in the quality of care. Well, yes, there are. Because in ANC areas where the level of accountability or oversight are lacking, well, generally the funds are looted even worse than anywhere else, which means there's no money left for actual healthcare. Now, these healthcare experts argue that without universal healthcare, remember we already have that, they say that the most vulnerable in terms of the poor, the rural individuals will continue to suffer worse health outcomes. Well, yeah, there is a way to improve that, and that is to use the funds allocated to you better and not loot them for the purpose of Johnny Walker Black Label and a new BMW. Now, I did look at who these healthcare experts are, and to be frank, they are just the same leftist academics at the University of Cape Town. I think we really need to stop listening to these academics at any of these universities because they are all insano, indoctrinated leftists that just have like Marxist ideas on the brain. These are not smart people. As Elon Musk said, you can have a PhD but still be an idiot. So anyway, that's just my view. Anyway, let's move on to the final news article. This is that the health minister moron is calling on various stakeholders to support the Office of the Health Ombuds. And he argues that this office plays a vital role in accountability within the health sector, especially in terms of complaints, oversight, and protecting patient rights. Now, Moron emphasizes that for the Ombuds office to be effective, it must be independent and must have adequate resources, and the public must trust it. Now, his appeal is given light of challenges in healthcare delivery and patient complaints about poor service or misconduct. And what I would say to the minister is, yes, people would support the Office of the Health Ombuds more if you didn't submit a complaint to it and never get a response. And when you did get a response, the response was, well, lackluster. In many instances, we all know that complaints into many of these departments go in but never come out. You send a complaint in and it will take you about a year just to get an acknowledgement. So if the minister really wants to improve the support that these officers are given, he needs to improve the service that many of these officers themselves provide. It's the only way you're going to get any form of support. If people deem it to be quick, efficient, and professional, they'll use it. If they don't, they're just going to think it's a giant waste of time. And let's be honest, everybody thinks that anything that the government gets involved in is a waste of time because it's usually inadequately resourced. People don't really work there in a very good fashion, and that's because the funds are all being looted. In any case, that's just my view. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. And before we sign off, I'm just going to leave you with two last things. The first is that a grant has been given in America to paint the face of the Ukrainian refugee that was killed. And apparently Elon Musk tweeted that he would contribute $1 million of his own funds towards the painting of this individual's memorial around American cities, and Andrew Tate also tweeted that he would also match the $1 million. So it does look like the individual's face will be appearing all over American cities in the very near future. On a very final comment, I leave you with this picture from the Insanos. This is the Insanos in the US that are all celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk, because nothing quite says reasonable and fair like this. Do let me know what you think in the comment section below, and until next time, bye.
Hey y'all, come look at this.
I just want Americans to know that communism and socialism and leftism is a mental illness. It believes in violence. It has been practiced in Soviet Union, in China, in Cuba. Hundreds of millions of people lost their lives because this mental illness believes in violence. And this is the mental illness now in America. And I watched the leftist communists post on social media that they denounce violence. They don't, because what they believe in is communism, is violence. We must stop it. Charlie Kirk is my hero. We have to defeat communism. We have to defend our freedom.